Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In just 3 years, the Biden administration has allowed more than 6 million illegal aliens into our country, 4.4 million deliberate releases, and 1.8 million known gotaways. Now, that's a combined population the size of the entire state of Missouri, our 18th largest state with 8 congressional districts. The Mexican drug cartels fully control the border. No one gets through without their permission. Every migrant pays a steep toll to them for illegal entry into the United States, and most enter owing them thousands of dollars. These debts are brutally enforced by the cartels in our own country, amounting to slavery for those in their thrall. Violent foreign gangs now do their bidding. MS-13, Tren Aragua, and others are already well entrenched in our major cities, openly recruiting young illegal migrants to do their bloody business. Now, we've warned for years that the Democrats' open border policies would soon produce the criminal gang and cartel violence now common in third world countries like Mexico, in our own neighborhoods and in our own communities, and it's clear that that's now happening. As just one example, earlier this month, NYPD officers arrested 5 migrants in a sting operation looking into a gang of criminals who use stolen mopeds and scooters to violently snatch phones and wallets from pedestrians, mainly women. As of February 5th, police had named 9 suspects, all from Venezuela, Ecuador, or Colombia. We all know of the 9 illegal migrants who beat New York police officers, were released without bail, and fled. One was just rearrested for robbing Macy's a week ago Tuesday. Just last week, a 15-year-old Venezuelan in a taxpayer-paid shelter shot a Brazilian tourist during a botched robbery in Times Square and then opened fire on police. 4 were arrested in Troy, Michigan for multiple smash and grab robberies at a mall. In Chicago last week, 4 Venezuelan migrants who'd been here for less than a month and had already racked up 3 arrests for retail theft and, of course, immediately released, choked a CTA train rider into unconsciousness during a vicious robbery. Kyla Hamilton was murdered in her own home by an El Salvadorian migrant that this administration released into our country, despite the fact he had a tattoo identifying himself as an MS-13 gang member. Kayla's grieving mother addressed the Immigration Subcommittee last year. Laken Riley's young life has now been added to this growing butcher's bill for the Democrats' open border policies. The suspect in that case, deliberately allowed into the country, deliberately released by this administration, committed multiple crimes, repeatedly released by Democratic prosecutors, and now this. How many such monsters have the Democrats already allowed into this country? How many more will they allow before the American people stop them? This bill arises from Secretary Mayorkas's infamous memo that instructs ICE not to necessarily remove illegal immigrants, even if they are required to be removed by existing law for criminal acts. Here's how that works. Under the Trump administration in 2019, ICE arrested illegal aliens who accounted for 4,700 robbery charges and convictions. Last year, despite a 153% increase in border encounters, ICE arrested aliens who were responsible for only 3,100 robbery charges and convictions, a drop of 35%. So while more illegal aliens are entering the United States than ever before, ICE is removing fewer criminal aliens from the United States. In fiscal year 2023, the Biden administration removed nearly 60% fewer criminal aliens with criminal convictions and criminal charges than the Trump administration did in fiscal 2019. Again, despite a 153% increase in illegal migration. So in what world does this make sense? According to a staff report released by this committee just last month, DHS's own data show that there are 618,000 aliens on ICE's non-detained docket who have criminal convictions or pending criminal charges. That means that more than 500,000 criminal aliens are in U.S. communities, free to reoffend and victimize even more Americans. The threats of Biden's policies are widespread, but this bill takes a small stab at common sense. The Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Commit Robbery Act requires ICE to lodge detainers against illegal aliens who commit a robbery offense and mandates that such aliens be detained in ICE custody. In doing so, the bill conforms to existing law that mandates detention and has been upheld by the Supreme Court. By mandating the detention of illegal aliens who commit robbery, including those who are charged with or arrested for a robbery offense, this bill creates safer streets for every American and allows for such criminal aliens to be more quickly removed from the United States. I urge my colleagues to support the Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Commit Robbery Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, robbery is a serious offense, and those who commit such a crime, regardless of their nationality or immigration status, should be prosecuted under our laws. H.R. 7334, however, is an overly broad bill that would result in extremely harsh and unintended consequences. It does not actually solve the problems with the immigration system and is just another attempt to target and scapegoat migrants. Under this bill, any immigrant who is present in the United States without admission or parole and who is charged or even merely arrested for robbery would be subject to mandatory detention by the Department of Homeland Security. While at first glance this may seem reasonable, there are some very serious flaws with this approach. First, this bill would result in immigrants, even some currently in a lawful status and who have been in the country for a long time, being subjected to mandatory detention. For example, imagine a scenario in which police officers are responding to a bank robbery and they arrest the wrong individual due to a case of mistaken identity. By the way, this is not a far-fetched scenario. It actually happened earlier this month in Rennes, Georgia, when officers erroneously arrested someone for bank robbery, and he spent 1 day in jail before bonding out. In another real-life example, a Detroit man was arrested and charged with armed robbery after the police traced the car used in the robbery to a man with his name. But the actual robber, as described by both the victims and his relatives, was 20 years younger than the man who was arrested. Despite this, he spent over 2 weeks in jail before a judge released him on bond. As our colleague Mr. Massey noted when considering a different bill at markup 2 weeks ago, people within ethnic and racial groups share similar names, which can lead to false positives on background checks and cause punishments to be handed down to innocent people who happen to share the same name as someone who committed the crime. This can lead to unfair racial disparities, which Mr. Massey wisely sought to combat with respect to gun background checks. It also puts many innocent people in jail, and this problem would only be exacerbated if the bill before us became law. If either of the individuals I discussed had entered the United States as a child without permission many years ago, but was now a DACA recipient or had temporary protected status, what would have happened under this bill? They would have had an immigration detainer placed on them. This means that they would be picked up by the Department of Homeland Security and would be subject to mandatory detention, even though they were lawfully present and were wrongly arrested. Does that make our country any safer? Moreover, under the Immigration and Nationality Act, a non-citizen who is convicted of or who admits to committing a crime involving moral turpitude or a CIMT is already subject to mandatory detention. Serious robbery offenses are generally considered a CIMT. However, the key here is that only those individuals who admit to or who are convicted of robbery would be subject to mandatory detention. But this bill goes way beyond that and mandates detention even for non-citizens who are charged or simply just arrested for robbery, regardless of the actual circumstances at hand. That is an overly broad and punitive expansion that I cannot support. I don't understand what my colleagues are trying to accomplish with this bill. Subjecting a wide range of people with lawful status, including DACA and TPS recipients, to mandatory detention is not a sensible policy choice and is not a good use of our limited enforcement resources. As we all know, Congress has never appropriated, and no administration has ever even requested, sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the mandatory detention categories. Why then are we broadening the scope of mandatory detention to include those who are charged with or merely arrested for robbery offenses? This bill also violates our bedrock principles of fairness and due process, ensuring that people have their day in court. Since when do we as Americans subject individuals to mandatory immigration detention simply because they were arrested or because a prosecutor decides to bring charges even though the charges may be swiftly dropped. I am also for protecting our communities from harm, but not with this overly broad and punitive legislation that does more harm than good. I hope the majority is willing to work with us to improve this bill to ensure that it is appropriately targeted at behavior that actually puts our communities at risk. Mr. Chairman, before I close, let me observe that a few weeks ago we considered a number of bills that all followed the same format, basic format. Find a heinous-sounding crime, even better if you can find a recent anecdote, then craft a bill with sweeping immigration consequences that go far beyond what is actually necessary to address the issue at hand. Require indefinite detention and deportation of certain immigrants merely accused of committing such a crime, even if they are lawful long-time residents, like legal permanent residents, or have a lawful status like DACA or TPS. No due process required, also that you can demonize immigrants and sound tough without actually making the country safer. Then repeat the whole process over again with the next bill. Today we are considering 3 more bills along these lines, and I expect that we will see yet more in the weeks to come, none of which stand a chance of passing the Senate. Thank God. Surely, we have better use of this committee's time. Instead of working towards bipartisan solutions to fix our broken immigration system, House Republicans dismissed out of hand a border bill negotiated by some of the most conservative members of the Senate, a bill that Senator McConnell said was the strongest border bill in 30 years. Meanwhile, we are hoping to avoid yet another Republican-led government shutdown as chaos and dysfunction continue to rule the day in the House. House Republicans are out of ideas and incapable of governing, so they retreat to their tired playbook over and over again, taking up bills that will make no meaningful difference and have no chance of becoming law simply because they think it will yield some political advantage. What a shame. I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7334.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purposes of amendment. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment simply makes technical changes and doesn't affect the underlying substance of the bill. I yield back.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, our gentle lady